If you're a kid, please make note of this. It's for your own good.
That water bug can only survive in stagnant pools. If kept out of water...
Wait, Sly, what happened to your hat?
Why swim when you can paraglide? When the oil main's all destroyed...
Sly, I think your hat has sentience of its own. I told myself I'd make this into a review marathon, and I meant it. A while back, I took a look at Sly Cooper and the Thievius Raccoonus. Review for it is up at that tag mark wherever YouTube has it put. But if you want the TLDW version, while it did have some issues and didn't do anything that extravagant with the 3D platforming genre, I really enjoyed how easy it was to simply pick up and play, and most of what was designed around it. And most people at the time it came out felt the same way, so naturally, it did very well. And when that happens, people want to see a sequel. Given that Sly's two PS2 comrades, Ratchet and Jack, already had sequels that stepped up the ballgame in different ways, not to mention Ratchet was getting a third game around the same time, Sly had similar expectations. And when Sly 2 Band of Thieves came out in late 2004, people absolutely fell in love with it. They praised how well it expanded upon aspects of the original, but also tried a ton of new things in terms of structure. The story was praised for being more intricate, the game overall looked and sounded better, and in general, it felt like things established or gradually being evolved. In fact, a lot of fans often consider it their favorite game in the series. As for me, I do get many of the reasons why this game is loved in the eyes of many, and heck, I really enjoy it too. Though I will admit, when I let some things sit, I get rather bothered by some things it tries to do. Got this thing started, so let's see how this adventure went down. Last time on the Saga of Raccoonus Doodus, yes, I'm spoiling the ending of Game 1 if you couldn't tell, Sly Cooper restored his family treasure, the Thievius Raccoonus, and defeated all the members of the Vienish Five, including the longtime nemesis of his family, Clockwork. But despite the fact that he pretty much tore Clockwork apart, his spirit and the parts of his body were left intact, albeit scattered. So while Inspector Carmelita Fox was rescued by, I'm assuming, some agents of Aeropol, those agents, like idiots, excavated the scattered parts of Clockwork and put them in a museum where I'm sure nothing bad will happen to them. So 2 years pass, and when Sly and his gang break into the museum holding those parts, they found out that something has happened to them. And during that instance, Sly comes to a standoff with the returning Carmelita and her new constable, Neela, who gives it the high probability that the ones who stole the Clockwork parts are a group of villains called the Claw Gang, comprised of Dimitri, a disco-loving, smooth-talking iguana who felt rejected by the world of entertainment, Rajan, a tiger who made his living selling illegal spice, the Contessa, who uses her position in Interpol as a cover-up to steal from criminals, Jean Bassan, a bison who is insistent on deforestation, but is smarter than he looks, and finally Arpeggio, a parrot who was picked on in his youth, so used his vast intellect to hatch a plan to become even stronger. After that suggestion is confirmed true, the plot here is basically finding out how to throw a monkey wrench into the plans of the Claw Gang, and steal whatever Clockwork parts they own until you have them all and can end Clockwork once and for all. I know this sounds about as simple as the one in the last game, and in terms of base concept it kind of is, but Sly 2 does a lot to raise the stakes and make this entire thing feel like something more. I do like how everything does connect into one continuous story, as opposed to the clearly separated episodic structure of last time, and they definitely took a lot of risks in terms of storytelling, putting the characters in the most unlikely situations, but when thinking of the things that string episodes together, that's when I start noticing some issues. I'll go over what I'd like to start off with. Oh, and I'll probably spoil a bit in this story along the way, so if you don't want to be spoiled, skip to this timestamp where you can hear my TLDW thoughts on this story. I'll give you 3 seconds. We good? Okay then. First off, I liked how much they made the Claw Gang more of a threatening group than the Fiendish Five. I mean, aside from Clockwork, pretty much none of Sly 1's villains felt like actual massive threats to the world. They felt more like villains of the day you'd expect. Not a bad thing, mind you, it's just something worth noticing when you look at them, and then look at the Claw Gang. Instead of doing villain of the day stuff, they actually do things and have plans that are much more dangerous than before. Rajan, for example, has been making a living off this illegal spice, and when you see firsthand what it does, that being turn anyone who consumes it into a ball of rage, and when you find out the influence it has on this plot, it actually does make the task feel more impactful. Same with the Contessa. Given that she actually plays a part in both sides to manipulate the situation, not to mention her power of hypnosis, it honestly does make her a stronger presence that needs to be taken down, which I appreciate. I also do like the sense of air connection between episodes. The ending of one episode is often an easy segue into the next, and it feels like what happens in each episode has an effect on later ones. There's not that much segmentation and things keep going, which does lead to a lot more engagement. Heck, some villains get to be in the spotlight more than once, which gives them more opportunities to stick out. It's also nice to see more characters get involved this time around. In the last game, it was quite evident that this was the Sly show from beginning to end. But here, Bentley, Murray, and Carmelita are given a lot more to work with, both in terms of development and in terms of fun moments. I admire how much further they took things with a simple setup, but I don't think every last aspect of it paid off. For what I wasn't big on, I know that's near impossibility to actually destroy the clockwork parts physically, if they can sit for a while in actual lava and still be okay, and the goal of stealing them is well defined, but why exactly do they just keep the parts with them around at all times? When they steal them, why don't they just find somewhere in the world to secretly stash them, making it so they'd be hard to steal back? They are fully aware that one part can do something devious, so carrying them around like this is just begging for them to get ripped off, which, what do you know, they get ripped off and clockwork is eventually built back together. That's not only an idiot move on their part, but that's just convenience to set up the climax they want to have. In fact, I honestly think quite a few complex parts of the story happen because of convenience rather than things being properly set up for it. For example, in Chapter 2, part of the mission is Sly dressing up to dance as a distraction. He goes in with barely anything making his face unrecognizable, and he still wears the mask. And because of convenience for the writers, Carmelita doesn't catch on to him. Usually when this is done, it's for comedic effect. But get this, they actually use this as a part of Neela's ruse to betray both the Cooper gang, whom she helped out with a few jobs before with her own agenda in mind, and even Carmelita. The idea of Carmelita suddenly working with the Cooper gang would seem way too abrupt given the story build-up it had, so the idea of something as comical as this was used to frame someone for a crime they didn't commit, and people believing it, is something I seriously do not buy in the slightest. I mean, okay, the Contessa being in for it does make sense if you consider that she and Neela are both Claw Gang members, but why does the rest of Interpol fall for that? I doubt that they wouldn't be so narrow-minded to not put two and two together to find something is not right. I suppose one could argue that Contessa had something to do with that, but it's never explained in the story outside of Carmelita saying that she's trying to clear her name in a later chapter. So to me, this conflict is really weak. As such, these twists do nothing but add a bunch of fluff to the game's length. The game has 8 episodes, and honestly, with how the story and gameplay are set up, I don't see the need to make it go on for this long. There's large portions where nothing of value is happening, so I feel like they could have fused some episodes, or just cut out the less necessary ones, because when a story's pacing gets bad, it does not keep my interest. And it's also still sad to say that I still didn't believe the Cooper gang were longtime friends, because the writing didn't support that. It's honestly worse here than the first game, if I'm being honest. Like, I know they're going for a sort of camaraderie, but some of the things they say honestly just come off as way too rude. Finally, for as much as I enjoy the Claw Gang as villains, some of them could have used either more screen time, like Rajan and Jean Bassan, or some rewrites like with Arpeggio and Neela. Now, to be fair, I can see what they were trying to do with Arpeggio, that being that this whole thing happened just because the parrot wanted to be bigger and immortal. I'm fine with this on paper, and I will give credit that this plan isn't too bad, but aside from his name being dropped a few times, one camera shot in Chapter 2, and one segment where he talks to Jean Bassan, he's practically given no build-up, no presence, and nothing really memorable. Even if this was meant to be played as a joke, the admittedly good plan completely washes away any humor to be had, and just leaves us with a really boring main antagonist, which for someone trying to revive the arch-nemesis of a family bloodline, is shocking. Then we get to Neela, and oh boy, most of my problems with the story pretty much revolve around her. Not only is her betrayal and the cementation of her role as an antagonist in the story really forced and really not well written, but after this moment, she completely drops anything interesting that could be done with her, and pretty much turns her into a whiny, juvenile kid when she's actually on screen, because holy cow, she barely gets any attention past Chapter 3, and whenever she does get attention, it's either cringeworthy, pointless, or both. It only damages the execution of that same betrayal I mentioned earlier, but it also makes her betraying Arpeggio feel completely unearned, not to mention it gives me no reason to care about Arpeggio at all, and her writing becomes even worse to boot. Neela overall damages the script in ways that make other characters look way stupider than they really are. She completely contradicts the overall more serious tone that they're trying to go for, and acts as a source of most of my problems with this plot. I'm going to hot take for a second here. I feel like that this plot would have been better if she didn't exist. That way, the possibilities of Carmelita having a better arc would be more open, there would be more time to flesh out the other villains, given their position of power and the attention that they garner from the public, and everything would just flow better. Sure, not everything would be fixed, but I'll take that over her. I know I went off on a tangent there, because at the end of the day, this story is not bad. It does have more stakes in it than last time, and it does make the threat more apparent. It's just that I was really bugged by the things it did get wrong, and they became way more apparent by the amount of space where nothing of value happens. I think it just needed work. That's all. It wasn't enough to try more with the story. They went with upping the presentation as well, which honestly really paid off in the end. Sly 2 as a game relatively late in the PS2's life cycle still looks really solid. Like, last time the environments had a lot of detail put into them and excelled in atmosphere to make you feel like you're behind enemy lines, but Sly 2 took steps in the right direction with this by giving each area something to call its own. The adventure will take you to some places that have similar themes to the first one, like a part of Paris, a facility in the jungle, and some snowy places, but there's also a town in India that is very appropriately constructed differently, and a castle straight out of a Halloween story, all of which are very refreshing to see. Helping this is that they're not really designed like fantasy platforming levels, but more like actual places that you can see existing in real life, which does a much better job of giving off a Thief-like feel. Only thing I would say is that it feels like the game has the same filter over everything. Even if almost every chapter takes place at night, or maybe early morning, I can't help but feel like there's some kind of filter that makes a lot of the areas blend into one another, or even wash some pictures out. Can't say the same for the character models and the way they are animated in cutscenes and in gameplay though. This looks so much better than the first game, giving off more expressions, not having mouths clipped through anything, and just overall looking like more time was put into them. Though I will say, at least on the HD collection, there is an occasional oddity. Audio was another thing I felt was done better here. The soundtrack overall has more variety than in the first game to fit each area, and the beats to a lot of these songs just really hook me a lot more than last time. Dimitri's themes easily take the cake though.
Let's dance!
Voice acting was also vastly improved. The Cooper gang was given much better direction, and genuinely sound like they become more in tune with the characters. The Claw gang definitely gets my approval too, really sounding like they mean business, but also having a good time. The only voice acting I wasn't sure about was Alicia Glidewell as both Carmelita and Neela. Now, I'm sure Glidewell's a sweet person who has long since moved on from this, but Neela's performance sounds like she's trying to cram in way too many styles at once, where it just sounds weird. And Carmelita's performance just sounds way too scripted, not to mention nothing like it was last time, and I don't mean that in a good way. Thankfully, even with some minor things, Sly 2 really does get presentation down pat, with a great new style with top-notch performance. And that's all it really needed to do. On base level, Sly 2 does take the core foundation of the first game, sneaking around enemy lines using acrobatics to complete challenges and things like that. However, what Sly 2 decides to do with it makes it something completely distinct from the last game. Rather than be a linear level not unlike Crash Bandicoot, levels are now completely open world sandboxes that are designed more like actual places, which is a very welcome change. They're all free to explore and do reward you for finding secret routes and completing challenges with things like coins, which act as this game's currency, which you can use to buy certain upgrades from ThiefNet, treasures that you can use to get a bunch of coins after running them back to your hideout, and returning clue bottles which are used to unlock a safe in each level and get another upgrade. I use the term upgrade a lot, but before I get more into those, let's get into Sly's playstyle. Sly's cane attack is still reliable in terms of taking out enemies, his acrobatics work the same way, and he comes with the spire jump and rail slide by default now, but there are plenty differences thanks to the mechanics and because of changes and additions to Sly in general. When you move the control stick normally, Sly will only walk normally, which in general is slower than the run he had last time, but he can get back up to that speed if you hold down the run button. This might seem weird at first until you take into account one of the biggest mechanics Sly 2 accounts for. Sound. Breaking objects and running are both very noisy, and if you do those near guards, they'll take notice and check to see if something's up. So now it's even more important to take your surroundings into account when doing something that'll attract attention. But if you do get spotted, it is actually not the end of the world, as while you will get attacked, you have plenty of time to get away, even if you get hit. Yes, Sly 2 completely gets rid of the Lucky Charm system, and thank goodness, it would have clashed with the design of the game. In its place though, Sly now has a health bar, meaning he can take plenty of hits before dying, though to balance this, enemies have health bars as well. Now I wouldn't worry about dying too much if you're fighting the weaker goons, as they don't hit that hard and can be taken down with ease, but the flashlight guards are much sturdier and hit way harder, so if one of them gets involved, book it until they're out of your sight. It also helps that lives have been completely removed, and if you die, you aren't sent too far back from where you died. This new way of tackling enemies also makes it a terrible idea to just sneak up behind a guard and just normally attack him, as well that might make them dizzy or kill them outright if you knock them at just the right height. Someone will catch on and this will make you vulnerable, but that's what this technique is for. By sneaking up behind any guard, Sly can knock them into the air and then smack them down, instantly taking them out. This is noisy and will attract attention, but you could easily run away from the spot, or use that to your advantage to take out more guards and even the playing field, which feels great to do. Alternatively, if you sneak up behind a guard, you can pickpocket them. Guards might have some kind of small treasure hanging around in their pockets that you can steal for yourself. It's indicated by a small light coming from their pockets, so if you see that, be sure to steal from them, as that money might help you in the long run. And as you go on, you can get new upgrades from ThiefNet or from the vaults in order to make these tasks easier. Most of them are pretty good. I'm particularly fond of the Smoke Bomb, Paraglider, and Silent Obliteration, though some I barely use like last time. And if that upgrade is a separate gadget or a side grade to a move like the Dive, which is sadly not as useful here, you actually get a choice to map them to 3 of the 4 shoulder buttons. I like this because it gives you a choice to stick with gadgets you really like using, or if you think one is more useful in a certain situation. That is a lot to take in, I know, but for the new structure, I think they did a great job adapting Sly to it and making him in general more fun to play around with, along with all these levels being more fun to mess around in. And that's before you take Bentley and Murray into account. In one of Sly 2's biggest additions, Bentley and Murray are playable in this game legitimately, not locked to a hacking shooter or a bad Jeep race, they're playable on the same level as Sly. And I think they help spice things up. Murray is an absolutely pathetic acrobat, as his jumps are mediocre at best, and he cannot interact with climbable objects except the shimmying ledges, but he makes up for that with the highest power and the most health out of the 3. It's a courage to get out on the field with him and just beat up anything you can. Even flashlight guards submit to him. He's a lot of fun, and I like how his playstyle forces you to approach the level in a completely different way. Always like using him, and his upgrades are really great too. Bentley, though, is just okay. His speed is really good, and he does get a couple of tools that can make for some interesting ways to get past enemies, but he's a little too fragile for my liking. He can't interact with many set pieces of the levels, and if any enemies get up in his grill, there's little he can do about that. Now, later upgrades he can get can soften this big time, but I still don't like playing as him as much as I would like. Thankfully, his missions don't rely too heavily on this, and try to make things as comfortable as they can be, which brings me to progression. Within the hub world are missions for you to progress the story. It's similar to how the linear levels are handled last time, with you getting things just to make your way to one pivotal moment, but the execution isn't finding keys to unlock a boss. It's setting things up to make the big bad of the day vulnerable, and then performing a heist at the end to get the clockwork parts of the day, and maybe smack a Claw Gang member in the head. Most of the time, these missions will stick with what the characters are capable of, and give them something to do with it, like great platforming challenges for Sly, and enemy gauntlets for Murray. Even Bentley gets a few fun platforming challenges, though there are some missions that are mini-games, and they're thankfully much better than before. I'm not a fan of every single one of them. The turret is used way too much and gets boring after a short time frame, and this tank controls like utter garbage. But then there are a few fun ones, like Bentley stockpiling energy and using traps to own enemies, or most of the hacking minigames. None of these are amazing, but compared to the first game, this is a step in the right direction. Boss fights are more on the debatable side. There are a couple that are fun, but there are quite a few that are on the repetitious side, and they start to get a little boring for my liking. But there is one boss in the game that didn't fall into this trap, and it's actually one of the best bosses in the series for me. The fight with John Bassan. I mean, after the setup for the climax has already happened, the first step of getting to it is going through this bison from the Gold Rush. As Bentley. But rather than rely too much on Bentley's non-existent combat potential, this fight has you constantly luring Bassan into 3 separate traps that can be activated with the face buttons, those being logs, saw blades, and flame geysers. The catch is while you're trying to keep your distance, you need to keep in mind where you are so that you don't get hurt by your own trap, which gets more tense as Bassan loses more health, as he'll summon enemies to fight alongside him and chuck dynamite at you. It's such a creative and heart-pounding fight, and it was such a great moment for the game that nothing else matched. Oh, sorry for that, I just want to express my love for that moment. So aside from some lackluster bosses, some useless upgrades, and a few bad minigames, is there anything else I dislike about the gameplay of Sly 2? Well, sadly, yes, and it's a much larger issue than all of those. The pacing. I know I talked about it in the story segment, but it only gets worse with gameplay. To put it into perspective, the first 2 episodes go on for less than an hour and a half, which is totally fine, as they do enough to justify that length. Then we get to the train wreck that is episode 3, which suddenly cracks that up to 2.25 hours, and it barely does anything to warrant that. There are many things I dislike about episode 3 on its own, but the length is a big part of it. And with the exceptions of episode 6 and maybe 4, every level from here on out is over 2 hours, which is way too long for what the game is trying to do, even some of the better ones. I will admit that some of the time was just me looking around the hub worlds and finding all the treasures and clue bottles I can, but I don't feel like they dragged out the episode for that much longer. As a result, finishing Sly 2 can be rather exhausting. I know many people thought that Sly 1 was too short, and to an extent I can agree, but I don't think stuffing the game with this much padding was the solution. For this reason, Sly 2 is not my Sly game of choice. That, and if you manage to get all the clue bottles and beat the game, there's little reason to go back to it. Despite all this, however, Sly 2 still refined the gameplay as much as it could, and I say it was the biggest thing that holds this outing together. Sly 2 is definitely a sequel worthy of the original, taking what worked and fleshing it out, while taking risks and trying new things. I love how each of the main 3 is handled for gameplay, and most of the hub worlds and missions are a great time to do. Though the plot needs some revisions, the game is a bit bloated for its own good, and it gives you little reason to come back to it after finishing it, so I don't think it's as good as it could have been. Nevertheless, I do acknowledge that its changes were for the better, and I still genuinely had a good time with this game, even more so than the original. This was a pleasant revisit, and I'm definitely looking forward to my revisits to the next few games. Next time, we'll be heading into the very last game Sucker Punch made for the series before heading out for the next generation, Sly 3: Honor Among Thieves. I am the Lane Gripper, and this is a fantastic boat.